Well, the BBC will have gone home, won't they?
Yeah. Yeah, totally.
See, like my response to that process would be, come and have a chat.
Yeah.
Don't just push her
Thanks
out.
very much.
Don't shout and ran.
Okay.
He's got
Did he come in here? I wasn't in here.
Yeah, he was stood at the back. He jumped on
was
his
he?
seat. I am a young climate activist. I can tell it why you still pushing fossil fuels, bloody, which is a legitimate. Javid said it's a legitimate question.
Yeah.
He could have waited his turn and not stood on his chair and shouted.
So what happened? They kicked him out of it?
Yeah, he said somebody just asked him to leave, but I would have just kept him in there. Let him hear the answer. Otherwise, we'll just get victimhood again.
How do you feel your new sort of brand incarnation is? Look,
It's best not to be a clunky acronym.
yes.
And it kind of, it's got a good kind of vibe about what we are, particularly with more health.
The principles
We should just look at it much more kind of...
We're good to go.
you get
All right.
4 or 5 grand per person on your list.
Welcome back, everybody. Thank you for rejoining us for the penultimate session of the day. And my name is Danny Kruger. I'm the MP for Devizes and former advisor on civil society to the government. And I just wanted to quickly say thank you to Create Streets and to Onward and to all the sponsors for putting this together. There is an old idea that feels very fresh in our politics, and it's old because it's truthful and it's the basic principle of what holds a society together, which is the strength of local communities, the obligations that we have to each other, the sense of place, and the importance of mutual obligation. And this pretty straightforward and ancient idea is, I think, becoming the dominant theme of social policy and of the political conversation around how to unite our country, level up in Conservative Party terms, but the other parties are also using very similar language. And what I'm pleased about is I think there's now an open competition about which party can most authentically own and communicate the politics of community and of place. And speaking personally, I work in Michael Gove's team at the Department for Levelling Up. I think he and Lisa Nandy both represent really articulate exponents of this idea. So I think it's a good time for this politics. And thank you to everyone who's been involved in making today happen. It's a great lineup you've had. So we're going to have a conversation around local democracy and community power. And I'm very pleased with the lineup of speakers. We've got Matt Leach at the end, their CEO of Local Trust, Sophia Parker from Joseph Rowntree Foundation, Sacha Bedding from the Annexe in Hartlepool, and Jess Studdert from New Local. I'm just going to let them talk rather than trying to introduce them and their organisations. I hope you guys will just say a bit about the work you do, but also try and answer this question about what community power means and how to reinvigorate our democracies at the hyperlocal level. And I'm just going to start at that end with Matt. So Matt, take it away. I'll give you 5 minutes before I cut you off.
Thanks, Danny. So I'm Matt Leach, I'm Chief Exec of Local Trust, and we're a grant-giving foundation that has put £1 million into each of 150 communities around the country, putting power in this. I'm assuming is my mic on? Just about. Yeah. Okay. Putting power in the hands of local people, enabling them to make decisions about where the money is spent to make their communities better places to live. I'm really delighted to see representatives of some of those communities with us here today, and indeed some of them speaking from platforms over the course of the 2 days of this fantastic event. About 10 years ago, I was in a venue not far from here, and I saw, if you'll kind of forgive me, somebody who's now, I guess, could be described as one of the grand old men of regeneration, a guy called Julian Dobson, give a speech on what he called urban acupuncture. And it was, as far as I can recall, it was mainly illustrated by photographs of flowers planted in potholes and pop-up art exhibitions on small pockets of otherwise derelict land. And I think the idea was behind his presentation, actually it was a point made by Toby Lloyd in a breakout group earlier today, that it's often the small stuff that makes the difference between a place feeling abandoned and a place feeling loved. And it's those tiny interventions that often provide points of connection, of commonality between people in a place that make them feel, part of a community, that make them feel like they're living in a good place. And if we move up in scale, I think, only slightly, I think the same's true about local civic life. The primary driver about how people feel about places, and actually this is well explored by research, is largely down to the connections between people in those places. It's the combined impact of the small stuff that's happening that together makes up the richness of civic life. And I'm talking about the sports clubs, the knit and natter groups, the walking groups, the book clubs, the community choirs and art groups, faith communities, the unofficial gatherings of people who meet on particular nights in the local pub or down the gym. It's the stuff that Angus McCabe, academic at Birmingham University, called the under-the-radar activity that makes up the largest part of civil society in this country. Although we often talk about, the constituted charities and the big national organisations, that's not what civil society is. Overwhelmingly, it's the small-scale stuff that brings people together. And it might not seem like much when you look at these activities individually, but together it's what makes the difference between places that are buzzing and those that feel empty or in decline. And I know from our work, local trust work in big local areas, that this stuff, the lifeblood of successful places, is the stuff that local people often prioritise rebuilding when they're given the power to spend money on reimagining their communities. And that is the stuff that's the engine of social capital. And the importance of social capital is something, it's something that we've explored in local trust through our Community Needs Index in partnership with Oxy. And what it shows overwhelmingly is that in places, particularly deprived communities, where there isn't social capital, where there's low levels of social infrastructure to facilitate it, a lack of places to meet and organisations and activities to bring people together, you see less effective communities, less happy communities, much poorer social outcomes. And when you plot them geographically, what you see is a map of places that are very much at the heart of the challenges facing us all when we think about levelling up. And these are places, left behind places, that when we look at them, we find that even when you adjust for relative levels of deprivation, they get only about a third of the level of philanthropic grant funding per head of other equally deprived communities. They're places that were 60% less likely to initiate mutual aid activities when the COVID crisis struck. And I think it's not unsurprising, therefore, that when the Levelling Up White Paper highlights social capital as one of the key pillars that are critical to successful place and successful economies. And the White Paper is also clear that where it's lacking, there really is a need for long-term patient policies focused on investing and supporting to help communities rebuild that social fabric that's been lost. And I think loss is probably the correct way to look at it, because many of these places most affected are those that actually were once full of activities. They're often facilitated and enabled by trade union shared workplaces, workers' clubs, community halls. And a lot of that stuff is no longer there. And that's a great loss, because these are the places that were often the key enablers of a local community's power and identity, the stuff that enabled things to happen. But I think this is maybe a challenge to someone on the panel. I think if the White Paper highlights this as a genuine need, I think what's perhaps disappointing is the extent to which to date, right across the policy community and across parties, we haven't really seen the development of a coherent set of policy proposals to address that, although we're promised with the community spaces and relationships strategy that may start to be addressed, and we await that with interest. But there is a lot of talk about community power and double devolution out there, about community power acts. And I think a lot of that is really worthwhile. I think the country is way too centralised. I think there's now a consensus on that. We undoubtedly need to disperse power and decision making, but on its own that isn't enough. power isn't a zero-sum game. We shouldn't view power as something that's solely created, stewarded, distributed by government. Power isn't created by consultation, participatory budgeting exercises, more parish councils or neighbourhood plans. And all that stuff is great in its own right, but I think we need to start to think and talk a lot more about how new power can be created, the incredible power that can be released as a result of people coming together, working together formally or informally, and as a result achieving amazing things outside of state-defined structures and activities, thinking of it as a resource, a new source of power, which is going to become increasingly important at a time when, you know, the economic challenges facing us both in this country and globally mean that there may be limits on the power that is available to be distributed through the state or indeed the market. So as we look forward to a new policy agenda, whether it's the community spaces and relationships strategy or consultation on dormant assets, which opens up a massive opportunity to address this over the long term, I think we need to also see new policy approaches right across the board focused on ensuring that social capital and the social infrastructure that supports it is developed, valued, maximised. To get there in our left behind places, we know that long-term community-led funding may be needed, I think is essential, but actually in every community we need to think about how we design in both hard and soft social infrastructure, the building blocks of social capital, when rolling out new development or initiating place-based regeneration, of the sort that we've heard so much about today. In the design of new place-based approaches to community renewal, it needs to be focused on the social capital bit. Government has identified that as important. Alongside financial capital, physical capital, we now need to see delivery when it comes to making that a reality. It's easy to talk about the big stuff, about economic regeneration, devolution, local government reform, better design, but in the end it's the street level stuff. It's the relationships between individuals, the ways in which those can build up across communities to create power, to create something special that's important. That's the stuff that makes a critical difference to whether a place feels like it's succeeding or failing. It's been today's been a brilliant day of massive, compelling vision. I'm really delighted Local Trust has been able to sponsor it. It's great we can talk about the big stuff, but at the same time, we also need to focus on the small.
Okay, Matt, thank you very much. Great. Well, we were detected there, Matt making a vicious attack on the devolution agenda and the whole idea of passing power from central government to local. So on that, I'm going to leapfrog to Jess here, who at New Local, formerly the New Local Government Network, but now importantly New Local, which you might explain actually, it's an interesting transformation the organisation has gone through, is leading the devolution, the campaign for devolution. So, Jess, do you agree? Explain what you're up to. Give us your answer to the question about what does community power look like. But do you accept that just devolution from the state to local government is secondary?
Well, Matt will hate this, but I would absolutely agree with what he was saying. Sorry. So New Local, we are a network of councils and organisations that work locally with local institutions and a think tank. So what we do on the think tank side is obviously very kind of practical, but very focused on the role of the public servant and how that kind of changes in this agenda, which is, I think, the other side of the coin to what you were talking about, Matt, because of course power rests in individuals and in communities, but from the perspective of the public service institution, it's important to understand, respect and work with the grain of that power rather than kind of seek to bypass it or seek to kind of rattle through it. And we work with councils, we work with public servants. Increasingly, councils don't work in isolation, they work with health partners, voluntary sector, so New Local is very kind of reflective of that reality in places. We talk about community power, it's a maybe overused term, or different people use it for different purposes. My definition of community power is that it's a recognition that communities and people themselves have the best insights into their own situation and circumstances, and if public sector organisations understood that, worked with the grain of that, supported that and enabled that, you get better impact for public spend, you get better outcomes and more sustainable use of resources. So for us, and I think, I don't know whether this is kind of too trite, but for me it's kind of helpful to understand and caricature or characterise traditional ways that public sector might work with people. I think of it in terms of state paradigm and market paradigm. Oversimplistic, but you understand the kind of difference. I guess it's the kind of history of the post-war bureaucratic state being very top-down, hierarchical, the kind of primacy of the professional, much more kind of paternalistic. We decide and we give to you. Our relationship is about kind of eligibility thresholds and definition of problem rather than understanding assets. Market paradigm, kind of scale, counter to small being beautiful, scale for efficiency is the kind of name of the game. Incapable really of addressing the complexities in people's lives because it's much more about reducing that kind of public servant interaction to a very narrow kind of costed unit of activity. And I think a lot of the challenges over the last decade really have been, you can kind of see that there's a declining efficacy of traditional ways of working. People don't want to be done to, and their problem can't be kind of, it's not a narrow kind of issue that could be resolved in a single transaction, but nor the demand challenges that are on public services at the moment, nor is it cost effective or morally right for it to be always the public servant's problem to kind of gift the solution to the individual. So there's increasing recognition of that. And it's kind of, we're big fans of Eleanor Ostrom at New Local. She had kind of decades worth of field work that shows that communities themselves are much more capable than kind of state and market solutions at kind of valuing the commons and sharing assets. So I think there's also been over the years, potentially within public services, just a sort of less recognition that people can be trusted to kind of understand what's right for themselves. But certainly lots of the organisations we work with, it really is about how you work differently with people. So I just wanted to make a couple of other points. Democracy in this context, I think, is often seen in our first past the post system as an event rather than a process. It's seen as a one-off thing. You turn up, you have your say at an election time, or maybe you respond to a consultation and you go away and get back on with your lives. The most interesting stuff that is going on in a local level is understanding democracy much more as an ongoing process, and something that really has massive implications for how public services as institutions behave with people. Local government's always been democratic in its sense, but the health service increasingly is understanding that understanding, listening to people, creating opportunities for them to participate in decisions over budget allocations. Lots of local authorities are holding citizens' assemblies, where the point is not to kind of have much more of a binary, like referendum style, yes or no, you're in this camp, you're in that camp. The point is more to kind of, at a much more nuanced level, bring people together to discuss issues and trade-offs to get to better outcomes. And I think that's one of the more interesting things that's going on in the kind of local government sphere at the moment. But it relies on the kind of insights and the expertise really resting with communities. Picking up on kind of Matt's gentle prodding, of course devolution, the policy of devolution has become very much one of that interface between national level and local government, which sort of suits the national level and local government. It's quite a technocratic discussion. It's very focused on a particular form of governance structure. I don't think people themselves, communities themselves, necessarily feel much tangible difference in their lives. It's become quite a kind of, you could say, kind of market transactions in terms of the deals that happen, and state-led kind of top-down hierarchical. I really think the kind of next phase of devolution, great that it's in the Levelling Up white paper, great that these two agendas are kind of coalescing. They are distinct, but they're kind of merging together. The future for devolution has to be people themselves feeling that they've got tangible influence over decisions that are made currently largely on their behalf. And how can we create a kind of new culture of democracy? So it's not just about voting, it's not just about the traditional kind of representative democracy that we're used to, but it is that kind of a different recalibration of how institutions see their role as much more enabling, much more understanding communities' wants and needs, and the skill set of public servants being much more focused on not doing to people and presuming, but listening skill. You see, lots of local authorities are looking at ethnographic training for their frontline workers to really have conversations that focus on deep listening and understanding, and taking that back to where internal decisions are made. This all doesn't happen in a vacuum, though. I have to make the point and reiterate Matt's point, another point of agreement. We are a very centralised country. Devolution does need to kind of evolve as an agenda. So it's really important that from the national level, it's not, community rights aren't seen as something that's in opposition to the council, but actually that they're kind of seen as increasingly, you know, it's a job of central government to support local government to have these conversations with communities and to face out. So New Local do support this Community Power Act, because I think it's important that there's some guarantee for councils to have, and local government to have, sufficiency of income and sufficiency of their role and sphere that they operate in, but likewise it's really important for communities to understand their rights and know their rights, and it's in that context that you can begin to kind of shift the relationship between communities and institutions.
Great. Okay, Jess, thanks so much. And I should say the community paradigm that Jess and her colleagues at New Local have developed is just the most tremendous framing, I think, of this new politics that I think we're emerging into, and it's a really, really exciting agenda. But let me just quickly challenge you, Jess, on your suggestion there that we need to go beyond democracy, beyond this technocratic transaction, paraphrasing you, between a voter and a, whether it's local or central government. I mean, what you're really talking about is, I mean, the value of democracy is that everyone's equal. It's one person, one vote. They're all equally represented. Whereas the politics you're suggesting is one where some people have more power than others, the people who choose to step forward, choose to collaborate. Isn't there a great danger of a new inequality emerging there about the people who've got sharp elbows or can collaborate most effectively actually taking over a place on behalf of what their definition of a community is, which might not be properly representative? Yeah,
I agree that's a risk, and where you have proper kind of deliberative forums set up. It's not just a sort of thing where you have an evening meeting and whoever turns up has a say. Deliberative democracy and citizens' assemblies or participatory budgeting, when it's done properly, people are chosen by a process of sortition, whereby you might apply, but only certain people come, and they're kind of weighted demographically to represent the communities. In the same way that jury trials, you're called up. So it's more of a kind of, you're not necessarily there because you've got an agenda, basically. Okay. So I think that there's one of the challenges of our kind of more traditional representative democracy. We have a kind of first past the post culture of, you say your thing in an election and then you kind of go quiet and
trust the politicians.
Trust the politicians, and they'll get on with it.
Good approach,
It's a lovely theory.
It's working so well.
And then kind of, and then we've suddenly got this kind of culture of referendums that have been kind of
also brilliant
put into it. So I'm all for deliberative, participative, consensus-building democracy.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, Sacha, will you tell us what the Annexe does and what your understanding of community power is?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting because I think to contextualise where I'm coming from, so we're in Hartlepool, which is 98% white. It's 85% of the people from Hartlepool are of Hartlepool, so it's a really static community. So in terms of having a sense of identity and a sense of place, it really does have one. But over the last, the referendum result demonstrated a sense of being an irrelevant place. Yeah, and the subsequent voting patterns that you have seen from that has been a cry for change. And a continual movement towards that. So they've moved from being irrelevant people to being really interesting now, because politically it's an interesting place. Where I worked, the Annexe, about 10 years ago, we were part of the community organisers expansion programme and the community organisers original programme, and we took a strategic decision as an organisation. Now we're a small estate of about 5,000 people. It's about a square mile. So when we're talking about small, like we are tiny. But we took a decision that at the time when austerity was hitting, we were all told to scale up and become like the Annexe North East. And we took a strategic decision that we weren't going to scale up, we were going to scale deeper, so that we would build a significantly deepened relationship within our square mile. And if place became irrelevant, we would close. But we weren't going to pursue trying to impose our philosophy on other parts of Hartlepool. And more or less, it's been, our relationship with our community has been really strengthened. And the organising approach starts on the premise of what you love about where you live, what you don't like so much, and what are you going to change about it? What are you going to do? And so rather than becoming a huge service deliverer, now we do deliver some service, we've become a much more facilitative approach about enabling a community and local residents to take action on things they genuinely care about. And that will range from, food insecurity to youth clubs. We've become a housing provider with the ultimate aim that actually we become much more accountable if they become our funders to shift that dynamic. And as part of the tenancy agreement, we've said words to the effect of, you've got to commit to social action in your place. So as a result of that, and a result of we're the locally trusted organisation for our big local partnership, who, again, we create the space and conditions where they can take decisions over their £1 million investment into the area. We've worked with Power to Change on catalysing community businesses. So we've been able to look at, if somebody says, I want to do X, so we start with yes, is it a project? Yeah? Is it social action, or is it potentially a community business? And work with people to go through that process. Interestingly, there's some stats which come out of that, which we're still at the wrong end of all the IMD. Hartlepool still has a life expectancy for men pre-COVID, which had declined 18 months. So we've a long way to go, but we don't really talk about what's wrong because we know what's wrong. We see that every day. But some of the really interesting stats which came out of this approach, our square mile statistically is more likely, somebody's more likely to have a conversation with somebody, a proper conversation, who isn't their neighbour. They are more likely to take actions on things they disagree with, whether that's like new power in terms of going out on a demonstration or signing a petition. And also, really, really great was they didn't create a mutual aid group during COVID. They just called it being neighbourly. They were just being neighbours. They didn't have to put a ribbon around it and call it something. They were just, it's a place which is in crisis a lot, and therefore, actually, COVID was just one more. They did loads of stuff, but they didn't call it anything just other than looking after John and Mary and so on in their place. So one of the questions, so what I've found in my time there over the last decade has been our relationship with the local authority, ebbs and flows, and it's almost like the stuff which really didn't work for local, things like survey monkeys, with predefined answers doesn't work. The sense of people being ignored, that they said they didn't want something and it happened anyway. I think one of the really big things which happened was like vision documents which came out on a regular basis and actually never got delivered on. We were having a Ferris wheel by the marina and so on. And all of that ends up with a democratic deficit, and politicians who've changed their political allegiances 5 times in 5 election cycles really doesn't help in terms of democracy and turnout. So the last local elections we've just had we had 25% turnout across the board, and actually that is a real issue. If we're talking about democracy, that's a real concern. Dyke House is now split into 3 wards, so a square mile, which is identified by people who live in that square mile as theirs, is now split in 3 wards, and a tiny part of 3 of the wards. So essentially, politically, they're irrelevant. They're never going to swing an election in their local space because of how the Boundary Commission changed it. And that leads us to, our big local partnership looking at should they become an urban parish council in terms of legacy and local resources and so on going forward, so that they retain their political influence. A long way to go on that, but it's in the process. What has worked is when the local authority have recognised relationships, and there's nothing better than them coming alongside people and working with us, and the institutions of the state coming alongside and working with local people to listen. You know, keynote listening should be the thing rather than keynote speakers. And that type of approach is really fantastic. Commit to a long-term approach. You know, and actually the churn in local authority and other institutional staff is really hard. So you create a relationship and it's gone. And then you have to start again, and there's nothing new in that. But I think what's been really good is when they've turned around and said, just don't ask us. If you want to do something and you think it's in the best interest of your place, don't ask, because we'll have to say no and we'll have to give you all the legislation. So, you know, the Assistant Director of Neighbourhoods, but don't tell anybody, right? He's turned around, look, if you're going to do something, just crack on and do it, and just don't let me know, because if you let me know, I'll have to give you all the health and safety checks and probably say no. So actually, sometimes just sitting on your hands and getting out of the way has worked really effectively. But that leads me to the point where I sort of like disagree with Matt that, you know, we've got power. We're exercising it. They've stopped the lollipop man disappearing off to somewhere else, and they ran a campaign because they didn't want him to go, because 2 years of COVID, and the community didn't want to leave a friendly face for their kids going to the local school. And it was a nothing decision, but actually for the first time people just actually, no, we're not doing it, and they stood up. And those institutions, and that's fabulous, and it's great that people have that. But I seem to think that unless we codify it, yeah, it's based on somebody saying, yeah, we like this approach, rather than turning around and saying, actually we've a legal right to say it and a legal right to do it. And fundamentally, as much as the £1.1 million from local trust has helped over the last 10 years, and as much as the Power to Change investment has helped catalyse community businesses, according to Claire's, Centre for Local Economic Strategies, our anchor institutions in Hartlepool spend £1 billion a year. And I would much rather our community have access to shaping that £1 billion a year than tiny little bits of like £100,000 a year. We will not be able to do that in any great way unless we have that absolutely nailed down in law. So that's why I would be completely for something which codifies and puts in legislation that people in communities have a right to change and shape how that's spent.
Thanks, Sacha. Fantastic. Brilliant and inspiring. I love the idea of the campaign to save the lollipop man, because that is, I mean, that is social infrastructure. Absolutely. It is most pure, isn't it? It's actually a human being. So, great. We're going to come to questions and comments in a second, but we've got Sophia from JRF, leading think tank and sort of do tank in this space. Why don't you explain what you're up to and what your answer to the question, what is community power?
Thank you. It's lovely to be here. I'm Sophia. I'm heading up a new programme of work at the Joseph Rowntree Foundation, looking at how we can speed up the transition to a more equitable, just future, which is very exciting. And I mean, our analysis at JRF really is that, you know, our mission is to solve poverty, and many of you in the room are involved in work around that as well. In order to do that, there is obviously a very urgent need to tackle the cost of living crisis. But if we're only focusing on the urgent and not paying attention to the deeper work around economic systems that are not serving people and planet well, then we will never achieve that mission. So the Emerging Futures programme is really focused on that kind of the deep work, the hidden wiring, what needs to change at that level of the economic systems, as well as what we can do in the here and now to actually protect people from the cost of living crisis that is hitting so many of us. It's great to be on this panel. There's a lot that's been said that I agree with, and I think, Matt, in particular, your kind of point about the way power is framed as something that can be bestowed. It's kind of everywhere. I noticed even in how the session is set up in the booklet. Can you trust local communities with their own direct budgets? There's this sort of sense that power is something that can be bestowed, and I think actually we need to, when we're thinking about community power, take a much more expansionary perspective. Local democracy won't be revitalised if what people see is a choice between one person and another person who look the same as each other but not really like you, and who are offering marginally different things. I don't think that's the place to start a discussion about local democracy. And I think we have to really think about it beyond that sphere of voting influence and representation and frame it more in terms of ownership and agency, a lot of the stuff that Sacha's been talking about. So I kind of had 3 things just to share today in the context of that, about what I think we need to be considering on this question of community power. First of all, is around community ownership. I think we need to be thinking, how are we building power by directing money and capital towards projects that expands the ownership of assets. And I think there are some absolutely brilliant examples out there. I know some have come up in the agenda today. I think Melissa from We Can Make is here. She's over there doing some amazing work down in Bristol, thinking about how to put housing assets in the hands of local communities. Similarly, East Marsh United up in Grimsby doing something similar. The Resonance have just launched a community development fund where they've raised the first round of investment and are looking to build 750 homes, 200 sports and leisure facilities, 300 community renewable energy initiatives, all of which are designed to grow wealth that is owned by the community. And I think unless we're really thinking in those terms, we're not really going to get to the place where we're talking about revitalised local democracy. And I have to say, I think I'm slightly concerned about, well, where are the institutions and all of this that are kind of shifting resources to community ownership in this way? Obviously, Big Local are doing an amazing job, Power to Change, but both of those funds are in the process of spending down or up, however you frame it, out. Community Builders Fund isn't there anymore. Where are the agencies and the institutions? Where's National Lottery on this? Where are some of the other government bodies that could be shifting money towards projects which are about ownership? So community ownership is my first sort of area. Secondly, community governance. I think we need to be thinking really intentionally about how we build structures and practices for community leadership that actually give people meaningful control over finance and other resources. So Onwards did a brilliant review of community regeneration initiatives over the years, and Sacha, you kind of talked about it as well, this idea that, in many places, marginalised communities, they're kind of littered with the debris of well-intentioned projects that come and go as personnel come and go, as different funds come and go. And actually, if we're really serious about community governance and building that capacity for community leadership, we need to be thinking less in terms of projects and programmes and much more in terms of institutions and endowments. So there's a brilliant example in Barking and Dagenham, where they've taken a levy from developers who are doing lots of building in the area, and they've created the Barking and Dagenham Endowment Fund. So this is way beyond the community foundation. And the community are not only choosing how that money is spent, but also how it's invested. And given what we know about the way investment drives sets of practices that don't serve people and communities well, I think that is a pretty profound shift and one we definitely should be looking at with real interest. I think the other thing that's really interesting in Barking and Dagenham is they talk about their work over a time frame of 20, 30, 40 years. So it goes to this point, this is long, patient work. This isn't just about what you can do overnight. You've got to be thinking about how you're building that community agency over time, because you can work at the speed of trust, but no faster, and that takes a little while to grow. And then my third area, which I think we need to be thinking about, is community action. I think we really need to put more money into how you build active civil society beyond the institutions, beyond the public sector, beyond our democratic institutions. A lot of movement work at the moment is in the sort of space of resisting and challenging, opposing things. At JRF, we're quite interested in a more futures-oriented movement building. So we're doing a lot of work thinking about imagination. How do communities get to imagine and build the futures that they want? And I guess part of that work is about tackling the fatalism, that sense that many of us have, that our lives are being shaped by forces way beyond our control, trying to kind of skewer that a bit and say, well, what if we imagine together? And there's some brilliant work going on by organisations like New Constellations, who've done some fab work in Barrow and Sheffield and elsewhere, to actually kind of orient the community towards what they call a new North Star of what's possible for that community, taking the community on that journey. Similarly, Unearthed, another really great initiative. If you haven't come across it, you should check it out. They've just completed a tour of the UK, replenishing the soil is the language they use, of communities up and down the country, thinking about what's possible. And I think it's really important then to link that kind of imaginative work about what communities could be to movement building work. And I think there, the work of the Civic Power Fund is fascinating, resourcing movement building in new ways that are focused on civil society rather than institutions alone. So yeah, those are my three reflections really. I do think we sort of need to start with ownership and agency. And I guess just to finish, I think the last thing I'd say really is this work goes way beyond political cycles. I think one of the challenges is how do you build this agenda that isn't party political, that isn't dependent on elections, that is about a real understanding that if it's not communities themselves who are thinking, imagining, building the futures that they want, who is building it and why isn't it them? And that's really the question that we should be challenging ourselves with. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sophia. Okay, great. And I love this thought of the of those projects you mentioned. Interesting, they're named looking for a new North Star and replenishing the soil. There is something ancient and almost spiritual about this work. The Levelling Up White Paper talks about the moral mission. And I think there is something very profound that, as you say, goes way beyond political cycles, goes way beyond our politics about this. This is a mission for a civilization to get this right and to give people belonging and agency, as we've been describing, even if it does get quite technocratic. It's much more profound, as you've been describing. So let's go to questions and comments, and we can keep it as a conversation rather than questions to the panel. But please, if you'd like someone on the panel to respond, please single them out. Have we got some microphones? Yeah, brilliant. Okay, let's come to the, seeing as you're there, gentleman near the back, and then we'll come to the lady here. And say your name, please.
Great, thank you. Julian McRae from Engage Britain. Really beautiful tales of optimism and things that can change throughout the panel's comments, but also interwoven with it with some of the negativity and the arguments that go against this. So I'm thinking centralised, UK is too centralised, or particularly the English state is too centralised. I'm about 25 years into my career now, and that's an argument that we've been making and has been made for that entire career. And there's a set of people at the heart of that centralised state who have a really convincing view on why they think it should be stay centralised. You've raised it in the panel, loads of issues about scale and a very particular concept of scale, evidence that makes small local initiatives virtually impossible to gather the type of evidence that's necessary, very short linkages, it must lead immediately to a job outcome rather than rebuilding a community and developing it. So I was just wondering from the panel, when you encounter people with those mindsets in some of our very centralised institutions, what have you found is the best argument to make to them to convince them of where you're coming from? Just the one that you would jump to first. And as an alternative, if you don't like that question, do you actually think that it's just wasting time? This is just pearls before swine. Actually, we need a new power and a much wider change rather than convincing the incumbent institutions that they've got to get on board with a new agenda.
Okay, Matt.
I think there are two answers. I mean, the first, in terms of evidence, is often the height of the evidence bar is driven by the degree of political will. So when there's a clear narrative that pushes in the direction of wanting change, then often the evidence required to justify it is lower. At the moment, I think actually we are in a period of change where some of the spurious barriers to accepting the value of community is starting to shift. Perhaps not yet in Treasury, but I'm hopeful. I think, to be honest, the best way I've found of convincing people of this agenda is to bring them to some of the communities we work with, whether it's Sacha and his fantastic community in Hartlepool, or the Lawrence Weston group down on the edge of Bristol, who have transformed their community, are in the process of effectively creating strategic autonomy by building wind farms and solar farms to fund community activity into the future without a reliance or so much of a reliance on the state. When you start to show people stuff which enables them to bring a reality to the word pictures you're creating for them, it's amazing how fast minds can change.
Okay, great. All right, let's go to the next question, but if you guys want to respond to that as well, feel free to jump in. Madam, yep, just here, thank you.
Thanks very much. Hi, some people might have heard me from this morning. Vanessa Gregory from Luxembourg's Our Community Voice on Design. How Luxembourg's came about was back in 2008, I had an interest in a vision document for our city and how it was going to grow, and the politicians' vision, perhaps. And we were, there were workshop groups, and I said I'd love to go along. And they said, but you don't represent anyone. In other words, I wasn't on a residents group, any recognised formal thing. I had an interest, I had a desire to take part. And I worry sometimes that we're trying to formalise how communities take place, community engagement takes place. We work in a charrette-based process where, yeah, people do come along that are interested, and they can engage in a different level. But if you start sort of saying, well, how are we going to arrange this new form of democracy? It could be putting people off. First of all, if I may say, with planning, for example, it's very easy to engage the community in what they want to oppose because they've been left out for so long and not listened to, and it's their community that is actually being done to. So can we not try, first of all, to encourage more people to take part in the democracy? And if I may say to the decision makers and those elected, there are two forms of elected representatives I've come across. One are the enablers that listen to members of their community in their ward, their district, whatever, and they try to support their initiatives and help them out. Or there's the other politician that said, you've elected me, now let me get on with it. And so I think that opens up an interesting way of how different people are getting round this different thing. So I think democracy, bringing democracy to the people and getting them involved can be messy to start off with, but they will soon start organising themselves as long as you try to make sure that everybody has the ability to take part and has an equal chance to be listened to. Sorry, it's very long.
No, it's absolutely fascinating, really, really powerful. Are you suggesting that what we need to do is to enable and encourage people to take part in the existing structures of decision-making, or that you think we should be creating alternative methods, or both?
Well, the problem is if you have things too formal to start with,
right,
then I think you are sort of channeling people and they think...
Creating a barrier.
You know, they're not... This is going to be just a tokenism thing.
Yeah.
Whereas sometimes communities, as you know, I've listened to all day actually, arrange themselves and get together on different things and come together. Yeah. In a bit of a messy way to start off with, right, and then they start organising themselves.
Okay, yeah, that's very, very clear. Sacha, what's your experience and advice for people who are trying to mobilise communities that might not really believe that there's any chance to make a difference?
I think there's two things. One is we always work on the assumption that I speak for me. So we try and minimise the chance that somebody can appropriate the voice of others, because you often hear the community think this. Well, actually, that's not, you think that, and you think that's what the community thinks. So we're really quite specific about I speak for me. And then what we do is you go for the small wins. You're right, it's easy to galvanise when people think something's been taken from them. But actually, if you turn around and give people the opportunity to actually make a significant difference, in Dyke House, they do. They step up. We've got a 4-day event coming up for the Jubilee, and we have got dozens and dozens of people cleaning up the community, doing all sorts of stuff, because it's permissiry. COVID gave people permission to do stuff which they would not normally do. We, as an organisation, create the space where it's the norm, and it's almost creating a new normal. And actually, you know, it's not the council's responsibility to pick up the crap that someone's dropped. Actually, stop the person dropping the crap, and then if you see it, just put it in your bin. And actually being quite as blunt as that with people. And but it's taken a long time to get a relationship to do that. So the opening start of it is have conversations and have a cup of tea. That, you know, usual, nothing rocket science about that.
Yeah. Okay. You are the they, and they should do something about this. Yep. I like that line. This gentleman, and then that gentleman, and then I'll come back to the lady. Thanks. Blue shirt. Yeah.
Thank you. Richard Harris from the Institute for Community Studies. 20 years of government white papers on regeneration have talked about social capital, and one of the big differences in the Levelling Up white paper is that as well as social capital, it also talked about social infrastructure, and a number of panel members also talked about social infrastructure. The Levelling Up white paper doesn't really define what it means by social infrastructure, and I was just wondering if the panel members would give their definitions of what they thought social infrastructure was, and who should pay for it, who in the public sector and who in the private sector.
Thanks, Richard. Okay, guys, think about your answer to that, and we're going to go to take the second question as well.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think it's quite interesting that
What's your name, please?
My name's Joel Cohen. I think it's quite interesting that we're talking about this agenda as a kind of a politics, because if it is, it's definitely a kind of small p politics. And I think maybe one of the things that I'd like us to discuss a bit more is what's the big P politics of these kind of activities. We haven't mentioned really the role of the elected representatives that we put in place to make decisions on behalf of their communities that much. And I wonder if our panel feel, and Danny's not going to like this, apologies, if political parties have some blame in the current state of where local power is today.
Okay, great. Thanks for not saying where you're from, Joel, because you're totally right. Nobody here is representing anyone but themselves, as this lady said. Great. So let's answer Richard's question about what social infrastructure is, and also, please give us your big P answer to that challenge about what's wrong with our politics that's produced the state we're in. Who's going to go first? Sophia.
I'd love to hear your definition too. So social infrastructure. So I think the first thing to say, from my perspective, what it isn't is just anything that isn't physical infrastructure. So I think it has something about weaving, connecting, growing relationships. That to me is what, and it's kind of institutions, movements, coalitions that set out to do that relationship building. That for me is what social infrastructure is, I think. Who should fund it? I mean, lots of people. I think it is something that typically gets overlooked in favour of projects by philanthropy in this country, and I do think there is a shift that's needed to thinking about those more kind of infrastructure type projects that are perhaps less visible, harder to quantify, harder to measure, harder to point to, harder to visit, but that are really, really important. And actually, I just wanted to, I'm going to dodge the big P question, and I just want to go back to Vanessa's point. I think one thing to say, in your experience, it's really important, like who gets to define the question matters as who's in the room to answer it. And I think opening up the spaces, as Sacha says, we start with a cup of tea, but actually allowing the questions to emerge rather than inviting people into a space where the question's been defined and asking what you think has got to be the starting point if you're really serious about building some of that social capital and social infrastructure.
Okay, great. Jess.
Just, I guess, trying to pick up on some of those questions kind of got at similar things, but just, I guess, where local power is and how we think about social infrastructure. I do feel it is characterised by, we have a centralised system of government which lends itself to how our processes are, but it also gives us quite a kind of, we have a centralised culture of how we do politics in this country. So everything is a national strategy to tackle this, and you see it a lot in the Levelling Up white paper. It's completely normal, apparently, for us to be talking about national politicians solving the challenge of our high streets. When national politicians can't solve the challenge of every high street. High streets are the hubs of local communities. We have a kind of tendency in this country to think that a decision needs to be made on high, a ring-fenced funding stream needs to be attached to it, and it will kind of magically happen everywhere. And we've sort of lost this principle of sort of devolving stuff. Well, you know, local governance needs to be enabling. It needs to be enabled by the centre to then have that kind of reciprocal relationship with people. And I think we have, certainly our national parties have interesting relationships with their councillors in local areas, because there's constantly that kind of pull. And just, I mean, going back to the first question, which I love this question because it's complete. I constantly meet people who inhabit Westminster and Whitehall who are constantly saying, you know, you can't trust local government with things because what about this kind of incidents of failure, and you know, they don't know, as if this kind of wisdom exists not just in the national parties but in Whitehall. You know, Whitehall is an enormous load of institutions, and the challenge always is, how do you prove exactly, how do you evidence things? You can't evidence a system that doesn't fundamentally exist, because we don't live in a fundamentally devolved scenario. So the way that I would always tackle it would be to say the cost consequences of the status quo are actually so stark, and you can quantify them. You can quantify the amount of money we spend on kind of contracts that don't work or initiatives to communities that don't last the course. So I think we need to start evidencing the failures of the current system, not just as a niche kind of technocratic governance thing about devolution, but actually it's a way of running our country in a more responsive way.
Brilliant. Guys, I'm so sorry. I'm not even going to come to you or to the other people who had questions, because we are now out of time. It's my fault for managing the session badly. I think that is a great answer. And I do, just my quick answer to the question about the politics, is I think it's the market-state paradigm. We left and right have been stuck on this axis between the market and the state for 50 years. And the key part of the equation, which is the third position, has been excluded. And that's what we need to get back to. And it all begins with campaigning for the lollipop man, I think. That's my definition of social infrastructure. Okay, thank you all. Thank you very much indeed to the panel. Thanks to everyone for organising. I'm going to hand over to Will, I think. Thank you.
Yeah, we do. We need a lollipop man or a lollipop lady. Thank you, everyone. Brilliant. We are now the only thing that stands between you and drinks, which is always a bad place to be. Thank you all very much for coming. We started the day some hours ago now with 4 key themes of place, of work, of community and identity. You'll be delighted to know that we are not about to try and summarise them all perfectly, but we'll just try and pull out a few key quotes. On place, I think one theme that ran very consistently through the day was we need to relearn how to make small improvements. I think as Matt Leach was saying just now in the session just now, that's the lifeblood, street level changes. We need to, but there are many reasons why we find that difficult to do in procurement, in design, in decision making. We need to reverse the focus, as Toby Lloyd put it. And there was lots of talk. This is something where we can actually get across the political spectrum support for that. Change needs to start closer to home, as Andre Reid put it. And that has quite important consequences for how professionals, how local councils think about their work, because we do need their expertise as well.
Throughout the day about the need to value different types of skills, different types of approach. We talked quite a lot about the need for more compassion, a greater sense of dignity. Indeed, as Michael Sandel put it, all labour has dignity. That's the reality that's got lost in the rolling news. But we also heard about the tension between what Michael Sandel called flourishing in place, what the government calls staying local and going far, and mobility. Not just mobility geographically, although we did talk about that, but also intergenerational mobility and some of the divisions that happen between grandparents and their grandchildren, or those different generations. Indeed, Michael Sandel again said the American dream is is alive and well. It is just living in Copenhagen.
Our third theme was community. And again, I think there were obviously differences of tone and timbre. There was a consistency that there has been really quite a profound change about how some of our society works over the last 70 years. Not perhaps that surprising. Again, from the last session, Jessica Studdert put it well when she said people don't want to be done to. There's a new culture of democracy. Perhaps put differently, I don't think we instinctively believe anymore that the man in Whitehall, and it was normally a man, that the man in Whitehall or in City Hall normally knows best. And again, I think that is a societal change which is not about to reverse, and again has quite profound consequences, because we do need that expertise about how we run processes democratically and professionally.
And wrapping all of those things together was the subject of identity. The question of how we go beyond a kind of divisive, kind of what might be called a culture war, to something that is more consensual and a more shared set of values. And I was very struck by something Rory Stewart said in the first session of the day, where he said that the way to get over the culture wars wasn't to focus on some of those big national debates, wasn't to kind of get sucked into big totemic issues, but actually to focus, in his words, on the local and the specific, your own neighbourhood, focus on getting broadband to Cumbria. And so it kind of seems to me that there is something in the importance of the parochial that we quite often miss in our big national debates, especially on social media and in the national media. And that was, I think, reinforced by something that Gemma Mortensen said, which was, I think, for what you might call the quiet majority, and we talked a little bit about the quiet majority in regard to patriotism, but this is true more broadly, the quiet majority perhaps shy away naturally from some of those cultural debates. And Gemma very clearly said, this is something we need to step into rather than avoid. And I was really struck by that, because just bluntly, as Onward, in the work that we do in my own life on social media, I do quite often find myself avoiding some of those debates rather than trying to present a voice of reason.
I think that's very true. There you go. That's our attempt to summarise a whole day's worth of discussion into about 4 minutes. So hopefully you'll forgive us if it's not absolutely perfect with every nuance in there. Thank yous. Today would have been impossible without our kind sponsors, our headline sponsors, Legal & General, Local Trust, Lloyds Banking Group, Barclay Group, or as they're known in America, Berkeley Group.
Our breakout sponsors, Countryside, Engage Britain, Historic England, JRF, JTP, Power to Change and Vectos, some of whom have had breakout sessions today, others of whom will have breakout sessions on day 2 of Restitch.
And of course today would have been impossible without all our kind and generous speakers. Thank you everyone, and we were so proud to be able to host the Restitchers, who already, we hope and believe, are starting to put some of this into practice on the ground.
And just a short word of thanks to the Onward and Create Street teams who have put today together at great expense to their personal lives over the last 6 months. Particular thanks to 4 people, to Eleanor, Katie, Belle and Lauren, who have poured their hearts into the programme, and we owe them a debt of gratitude. Thank you.
I certainly agree with that, as I couldn't agree more. I hope the way we have run the conference today has been in the spirit that we tried to start it, of disagreeing well. I think how we relearn how to do that is something, it's the thing I feel most passionate about beside the importance of place. We've tried to assume good faith in the people we're possibly disagreeing with, and to think carefully about how we use language in a way that unites, not divides us. The British parliamentary democracy is legitimately robust and punchy, but there is something quite important there. So thank you all for being part of that as well.
In a moment, we're going to usher you through to drinks, and I hope you will continue in that spirit of disagreeing well in the various debates and discussions you have over an afternoon aperitif. If I could also ask that when you leave the building, because we do believe in sustainability, to the man who stood on his chair earlier, to his point, we will be recycling our badges from today and taking them up to Halifax. So if you could leave your lanyards at the front desk, don't take them away as a souvenir, as much as I know you'd like to, that would be fantastic. And in the spirit of Halifax, just to give you a little bit of a preview of what's to come, can I now hand over to Jane Scullion. Jane.
Thank you, Will. It's my job to do the pitch for Halifax, because we're going to pivot to the north. The north has appeared in dispatches throughout today, but here is an opportunity to actually see how things are being done. And I don't think you can quite see it because of the chairs there at the moment, but there is a marvellous banner right in the centre of the stage. Now, that is not a city in Tuscany, that is Halifax. That is the marvellous Peace Hall. piece in the sense of pieces of cloth. It's, I think, the only remaining cloth trading hall in Europe, 1779, and restored to fantastic condition. But it's at the heart of Halifax, which is at the heart of the borough of Calderdale. And I'm not going to talk about the marvels of Calderdale and its buildings and so on. Time enough to hear about that if you come to Halifax. But I wanted to talk about one of the principles we try and live our local government and borough life by. It's a great place to visit, but actually it's a place in which everyone can live a larger life. Whatever your background, whatever your circumstances, that's our job, is to help people to live a larger life. Now, Halifax itself, old textile town, so very suitable for Restitch. We are working on restitching the fabric of Halifax and Calderdale. It's full of mills. It could have been an area that really was in decline and getting run down and left behind. But we are actually working on how we flourish in place, how we restitch the fabric of the area. And we're doing that in a number of ways. Just some of those ways are obviously repurposing our heritage. You know, those buildings are great, those mills are great, but actually we're repurposing them for the modern day. And why are we repurposing them? We're partly repurposing them to give pride in place, so that people actually have a pride in place that's not based on nostalgia, not based on the 50s or the 70s, but actually in the places it is now, the way in which we're attracting tourism, filming. We had Marvel films there the other day. I did have to have somebody explain to me who Samuel L. Jackson was, but we're having a moment in terms of Gentleman Jack and various other things. Repurposing our heritage buildings to give people pride in the now, not just about nostalgia. We're doing a lot of engagement and dialogue on the kind of things that you've just heard about, and also really coming to terms with the fact that as a council, we are not the organisation who's doing things. We are all doing things. We are all recovering from the pandemic. We are all tackling climate change. We are one of the partners in that enterprise. We're also doing a lot of asset transfer, making sure that we share that ownership of buildings, parks, places, and doing quite a lot of community-led housing. I'm a great advocate for modern almshouses. Why are we not building almshouses, you know, community-led buildings for older people across the borough? But I wanted just to give you a bit of a flavour of the kind of place that Halifax and Calderdale are. And I want to really make you think, yes, Halifax, even if you can't come on Friday, come another time and see what we're doing to restitch the social fabric of our area. We're thinking about 5 things in everything that we do. We're thinking about how we're distinctive. We're thinking about how we're enterprising. We're thinking about how we're talented. We're all talented people. And we're thinking about how we're resilient, because we suffered a lot from flooding, pandemic, etc. But absolutely crucial in terms of the features of Halifax and Calderdale is kindness. So that's the kind of borough we are. Come and see us. Come and see how we do it. You're very welcome. Thank you.
To that. Amen to that. Do come to Halifax. If not Friday, then certainly another time. And to get us all in the mood as we go for drinks, Eleanor is going to play us all out. Thank you, Eleanor. Take it away. Thank you, everyone.